One of the only literary fiction writers to gain any type of mainstream traction over the last, say, 30-ish years, David Foster Wallace. You would have thought that he would have appeared on the channel before now, but we'll get into the reason why he is not in a moment towards the end of the video, so people don't hate me too much. Well, you probably already know where I'm going with this, but we are here today to talk about a short story, some short fiction from David Foster Wallace. Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where literature lives. I am Adrian Fort, and we are here for a short story discussion, pardon me, which will appear in the short story discussion playlist here on the channel. This video will have 3 sections: a So What Happened recap of the short story, a literary criticism section, which I will most definitely stumble through because my notes are very, very jumbled, and finally a writer's corner section of this video where we talk about the things that we could take from this short story as writers ourselves. So, what happened? Well, let's start here. I'll tell you what didn't happen. Paragraph breaks. Holy great wall of text, Batman. We just have one big block of words here. That kind of, from my experience, and I haven't read a whole lot of David Foster Wallace, but from my experience, kind of one of his tricks of the trade. He's gonna go, man. So there is that Lane and Sherry are at the park. Boyfriend and girlfriend, don't you know, they met in campus ministries. And Lane, at least, is very religious. Or so he thinks. He really wants to be. It seems he tries to pray a lot, struggles with that part of things. And Lane will be there for her. He's going to be there for Sherry. For what? He's going to be there, and he wants her to know that. For what? Oh, an appointment. Abortion. It's an abortion. Okay, so there's a lot of quote-unquote internal struggle with this short story. And I say quote-unquote because obviously if you've read the short story, that's basically the entire short story. But go ahead and Google it. Google this short story, and it will just tell you everything is internal struggle. So I had a question about what actually happens, and I'll get to that in this summary. So I was like, okay, let me just look up a summary to see if there are any kind of, if I can take anything from that. I'm not going to believe the summaries because sometimes they're untrustworthy, but I want to know if there's a general consensus over what happens at the end of the short story. I couldn't get there in any of them to the actual summary of the short story. You Google a summary of Good People by David Foster Wallace, and the summary goes for about 2 sentences before every summary you find goes on a rant about internal struggle. And then we get back to the summary, none of which, by the way, answered the question that I had. So you have a whole lot of internal struggle with Lane, and then we get this in the short story. This is what we are told from our author. Oh no, what did I do here? This down-to-earth girl that smelled good and wanted to be a nurse would take and hold one of his hands in both of hers to unfreeze him and make him look at her, and she would say that she cannot do it. We don't know, I don't think, by the end of this short story, whether that happened or not. In the moment of the short story, Lane is almost suggesting that he is prophesized that this is going to happen. I don't know that we actually get the insinuation that it happens at the end of the short story. So one of 2 things is happening here. One, Lane has this prophecy, however you feel about that, and then it happens. Or 2, Lane is fantasizing at the end of this short story, and it never actually happens. But I don't think we actually have the conclusion on the page. I think the actual, so there's also a little bit of trouble in that section with tense. Will do, would do, could do, has done, will say, would say, all of these sorts of things there. So I think I am going to contribute that to David Foster Wallace as on purpose. I think that that is part of the artistry of this short story. We are not supposed to know. We are not supposed to be told. We are supposed to have in our mind's eye some vision of what it is that actually played out. And that is part of the interpretive dance that a reader has with this text, at least as far as I'm concerned. So we don't know either this is a vision from God, or we don't see what actually happens, or he has had this vision before, it actually happened. So, literary criticisms, what is there to talk about in this piece? Well, something very, very interesting right off the bat. And my desk is a little jumbled, so give me a moment because I've got to mash everything around here. Very early in this short story, we get this. We are painted the picture of these two young people in the park meeting with each other, and it was springtime. And so, by the way, obviously, springtime, dealing with the pregnancy, we have symbolic reason to believe that at the end, she goes through with it. So if you're writing a paper on this short story, go with that probably. You've got the mention of the spring, you've got the mention of the flowers very early in the short story. You have the prophecy at the end. So the birth of this child is foretold. It was springtime, and the park's grass was very green, and the air suffused with honeysuckle and lilacs, both, which was almost too much. You want to hear something interesting about that passage? So what do we have mentioned there? We have the grass was very green. The air was suffused with honeysuckle and lilacs. And even, if we go one sentence further, there were bees. Okay, so just an inventory. Grass, lilacs, honeysuckle. We're assuming honeybees because those are the most common. You know what's funny about all four of those things? They're invasive. They are not, well, so most honeysuckle, the most common honeysuckle, is invasive. I know this because my friend talks about it all the time. She is on a holy crusade against honeysuckle. But lilacs were brought by the Puritans, at least as far as the mythos around lilacs goes. Maybe that is not correct. Honeybees were brought over by Europeans. The grasses that we have were brought over by Europeans. And so too, the honeysuckle that is invasive is brought over in the early 1800s, mainly for decoration, at least as far as I can find. So what we have there is setting up this story in the springtime, the nascent season, with invasives. Very nice, David Foster Wallace. Very, very nice touch there. But it is still open to interpretation. Invasive, got it. Springtime, got it. What's invasive? From one end of this short story, so if we're reading this as if Sherry at the end cannot go through with the procedure, Sherry feels as if the procedure is very invasive. Okay, got it. Lane feels as if that baby is very invasive. So you can go with that factoid from this short story in either of the major narrative thrusts from either character in the short story. Uh, Perhaps Sherry, too, believes that the child is invasive. We don't really know. We don't really have all that much to go off of with Sherry herself. So there's that. Now, the next thing worth talking about here, I've dropped my pen. David Foster Wallace was born in New York, East Coast. David Foster Wallace died in California, West Coast. So tell me how it is that David Foster Wallace ended up writing the Midwestern Hills Like White Elephants. That's exactly what this short story is. This short story is Hills Like White Elephants, but you put it in Illinois, the Midwest, and you gave us two, at least tangentially, religious individuals. So it might be that David Foster Wallace was under the impression that everyone in the Midwest goes to ministry at their community college. I don't know. But I don't think that was his assumption. So I think that the choice for them to have met in ministries tells us something about both of them. Now, interestingly, Lane seems to be the one that takes religion more seriously, but is also the one that is, if you are looking at this from the prism of the religion in question, from Christianity, is the one distancing himself from the teachings more than Sherry, if Sherry actually cannot go through with the procedure, with the abortion. But both of them partook in that premarital. So there is that to be considered. When we are looking at this short story and we are comparing it to Hills Like White Elephants, well, we'll get to that a little bit more in the writer's corner portion of things. But I think that it is, if you're writing a paper on this, that's a great topic to go with. Compare and contrast the two. But these characters are very different, Sherry and Lane, than the American and... I'm blanking on her name right now. It's Tink or something like that. I can't remember the woman's name, what he calls her in that short story. But these two characters are very different than those two characters, and yet here they are in the same predicament, making the same decision on what it is that we're talking about. Now, here is where we're going to get into some hullabaloo with this short story. The title, Good People. What is good? What does it mean to be good? Because I think that we are tempted to say Lane is not good. I think that the writing in this short story is urging us, and this is a David Foster Wallace thing. David Foster Wallace, from my understanding, was very much about putting the writer's opinion in the work, which is different than most literary fiction. And I think we're going to talk about that again in the writer's corner portion of things, but I think that it does a disservice to the writing most of the time. If the reader can come away from your short story for sure what the writer thinks, I think it does a disservice to the actual story and the moral, even if there is an actual one side of the moral, and it seems there is here, that the writer wants to get across. But good, the choice of the word good in the title. We are supposed to question whether that statement is true. Good people. They want to be good people. Are they good people? Can good people go through with that procedure? Okay, that's, I think, the point and purpose of the short story. But I think it's a terrible word choice, good. Maybe that's not fair. I think that I think that it is a difficult word choice to go with good, because nice and kind are different things, and I can tell you how. Good and bad are different things, but the difference there isn't interesting. Good and bad is pretty clear cut in many things, and even when it isn't, the designation of good and bad, the more interesting mechanism there is the decider, right? Who is it that's deciding the good and the bad versus what is the good and the bad? What's the difference between nice and kind? Because we have, in my opinion, the real stress in this story is because Lane is a nice guy, not a kind guy. Here's the difference between nice and kind. You have to deliver a speech, and you've got two friends, pardon me. You were part of a 3-friend group. More friends than I have, by the way. So, congratulations. You're sitting there with your 2 friends, and it's almost your turn to give a speech. You have broccoli in your teeth. The nice guy in the group does not tell you. The nice guy in the group wants you to feel confident going to the front of the room. He's very concerned about your feelings. The nice guy wants you to feel good. The kind guy says, "Hey, dummy, get that out of your teeth before you go make an idiot of yourself." That's what the kind guy does. Kindness means I will help you. Niceness means I am concerned about your feelings. Lane is a nice guy. That's how he's gotten himself in this predicament where he's having very not nice thoughts, which we'll talk about in a moment. So, when we're talking about someone who is very, very religious, or at least tries to be very religious, we have to ask why these thoughts would pop up. He rarely before now had thought of damnation and hell. That part of it didn't speak to his spirit, and in worship services he more just tuned himself out and tolerated hell when it came up. The same way you tolerate the job you've got to have to save up for what it is you want. He's too nice to believe in hell. Well, whether you believe in that broccoli in your teeth or not, it's there. And if you are a Christian, whether you believe in hell or not, it's there, right? So that is something that is pointing us in the direction of who Lane is. He's too nice. Further in the short story, we get this. But neither did he ever open up and so this is as he's struggling with whether or not what to say to Sherry. But neither did he ever open up and tell her straight out he did not love her. This might be his lie by omission. He's too nice to tell her. He doesn't want to hurt her feelings, right? Instead, he just keeps having sex with her and being nice to her. This might be the frozen resistance, were he to look right at her and tell her he didn't, she would keep the appointment and go. He knew this. If he told her he didn't love her, she'd go through with the abortion. Something in him, though, some terrible weakness or lack of values, could not tell her. It felt like a muscle he did not have, a weakness. He did not know why. He just could not do it or even pray to do it. Again, these struggles with praying. She believed he was good, serious in his values. She believed. She has a feeling. He does not want to upset that feeling in her. Part of him seemed willing to more or less just about lie to someone with that kind of faith and trust. Very infatuated with his image. You cannot care what people think about you. And what did that make him? How could such a type of individual even pray? If you were so concerned about what other people think of you as to mislead them, how could you even talk to God? That is the question being asked there. Then we get this a little bit further in the story. He was looking or gazing again at where the downed tree's branches seemed to all bend so sharply just under the shallow's surface when he was given to know that through all of this frozen silence he despised, he had, in truth, been praying, or some little part of his heart he could not hear had, for he was answered now with a type of vision, what would later call within his own mind a vision or a moment of grace. He was not a hypocrite, just broken and split off like all men. So, life happens to nice people. Life happens to them because of the things that they are afraid to do. And this type of rhetoric here, where he's talking about, oh, I'm not bad, I'm not a hypocrite, I'm just broken and split off like all men. I don't have, so I'm going to get into some examples that might be problematic for people, might get people mad at me. I don't have an eating problem. Everyone likes to have a piece of cake. Okay, but at some point, if there's a problem, you have to recognize it in order to work on it. I'm not lazy. No one likes to run a mile. Okay, but at some point, if there's a problem, you need to recognize it. I'm not behind in my schoolwork. No one likes to do their homework. Well, okay, but at some point, if there's a problem, you have to recognize it. This type of rhetoric, we're all fallen, is a very nice way not to hurt your own feelings and continue doing the same dumb things that are ruining your life. That is what we have here from Lane. And while we are talking about Lane, the last point that I want to make on the literary criticism part here is this. So, we have quite the ditty here from Lane. This is as he is talking to himself as opposed to talking to her. The appointment could get moved back. If she just said the word, they could push it back to take more time to be sure in the decision. It was still so early in it. They both knew that, he said. This was true, that he felt this way, and yet he also knew he was also trying to say things that would get her to open up and say enough back that he could see her and read her heart and know what to say to get her to go through with it. He knew this without admitting it to himself, that this was what he wanted, for it would make him a hypocrite and a liar. He knew, in some locked up little part of him why it was that he'd gone to no one to open up and seek their life counsel. Not Pastor Steve, or the prayer partners at the campus ministries, not his UPS friends, or the spiritual counseling available through his parents' old church. So, we get in that moment an insight to who Lane is. Lane and what Lane wants. Lane does not want this child. Okay? And I get the very strong feeling David Foster Wallace wants us to not like Lane because of that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think the short story is written in a way as to expose Lane for being weaselly. Don't you get the sense that he's a little bit weaselly here? Do we judge Lane here? Do we hold this against Lane? Do we think less of Lane because he wants Sherry to go through with the procedure? Do we think negatively of him? I think the story is written in the way that we're supposed to. If you do think lesser of Lane because of his desire for Sherry to go through this, he's trying to say the right things to convince her, would you feel the same way about Sherry if she were the one who did not want the child? Would you? If not, I'd like to know why. I think we are largely programmed by society to feel this way about him, but not feel this way if this were her desire. If you can legitimately reason your way into tearing Lane down, but defending Sherry, should that have been her choice, I'm interested in it. Because, look, I get the it's her body argument, but when it's her body and she's the one wanting the procedure, that is still not the same thing, right? I think if we feel differently about Lane, there has to be a reason. Lane is... They both made that decision. We've no reason to believe they didn't both make the decision to go through with the hubba hubba. At some point in the short story, they both seem to love each other. At some points they do not. To feel differently about one of them wanting the child versus not, and then flipping those roles, I think it takes an actual explanation, a moral, values-based explanation. And I'm not taking either side on it. I'm not here, right? I just think that if you're going to hold those conflicting views, you have to have a reason. Now, let's go to the writer's corner portion of this. What can we take from this short story as writers ourselves? Well, I'm going to give you my honest opinion on David Foster Wallace. And I'm not saying this to be inflammatory. I'm not saying this because I'm trying to convince you, just by what short story we just read. And I'm not saying this because I think I'm the arbiter of truth here. I can't stand David Foster Wallace. Can't stand him. Not him, his writing. I can't stand his writing. For me, David Foster Wallace reads as if Ernest Hemingway took MDMA. A lot of the same type of word choice, but just babbling. I can't like it. I've tried. I wanted very hard when I was in grad school Obviously, in grad school for creative writing, you're supposed to like David Foster Wallace. I put on my hat, I sat down in a public library, and I said, okay, let's make this work. Couldn't do it. So the reason I bring that up is nobody cares what I think, right? David Foster Wallace still sells books on books on books. So I say that to say this. Your style as a writer, it's very possible when you're workshopping things, when you're trying to gain your voice, if David Foster Wallace was in my master's program, oh, I would have been immortalized for being the guy who tried to get David Foster Wallace to quit writing. Right? Because all of my feedback would have been, hey, you can change this, you can do this different, you can do this better, this can be sped up. Walls of text are not very inviting to a reader. It would have been very bad for me to be in that class, right? It's very possible that as you're developing your voice, you run into someone who just doesn't get your writing. And it's important to remember that. It's also important to remember maybe they do get your writing, and maybe it's just not very good. So you have to keep that discernment. The next thing is this. This is pretty obviously a retelling of Hills Like White Elephants. I guarantee you David Foster Wallace had to read Hills Like White Elephants at some point in his education. Not saying he didn't read it before that, not saying he didn't read it after that, but this reads as if David Foster Wallace was kept being told, oh, Hills Like White Elephants is so good, Hills Like White Elephants is so good. Oh yeah? I'm going to do you one better. Right? This is so blatantly a retelling of the themes from Hills Like White Elephants that I don't know how you read this short story and don't think of Hills Like White Elephants if you've ever read Hills Like White Elephants. If you come for the king, you'd best not miss. I don't think this short story hits. I really don't. There's some interesting things going on, right? So at one point I was very much more well-versed on his arguments against Hemingway. I have since forgotten a lot of those. I've, been years now, but you can Google it even. And if you Google David Foster Wallace on Hemingway, this is one of the things that pops up. Rejection of the iceberg theory. So Hemingway is very famous for Hills Like White Elephants because of the iceberg theory involved. You get very small details in Hills Like White Elephants, but you know everything that's going on. You only see the little bit top of the iceberg. The big story is under the water. You're never told the big story. You have to insinuate it. Wallace did not subscribe to Hemingway's iceberg theory, which held that the unsaid formed the greater part of the artistry. Wallace's style became known for its maximalism, verbosity, and exhaustive detail, standing in stark contrast to Hemingway's sparse prose. Again, he reads like Hemingway on MDMA. And I just can't get into it. I can't like it. But I think that if you're going to, probably there's a short story like that for you as a writer yourself. If you're going to take a classic short story or poem or novel and you're going to quote unquote redo it, remix it, I think it pays to actually change more than the setting. What if it's her trying to talk him into why the abortion should be had? Well, that's one way to change it, right? You're changing the entire perspective there. You're changing the entire. And that's what I thought this short story was going to do at first, because Lane kept setting himself up as so very religious. It's not where we ever got. Okay, great. So you've got the same parties involved in the same halves of the argument. You've just got a different setting. Well, what if it's not an abortion? What if it is why we should start trying to have a kid? What if it's all sorts of things? What if it's on effing Mars? What if it's Martians and what you're doing is after in that alien race, the mother dies upon giving birth, right? What if it's that argument? But we're just rehashing the same thing, but with more words and a less pretty setting. That's it. So I think if you're going to come for the king in that fashion, you'd best not miss. And that is Patrick Mahomes down there. I have a third point here. I guess I never typed it up. Because of the close psychic distance. What is psychic distance? Psychic distance is how close to the character's thoughts your narrator is. So first person narrative is immediate psychic distance. You're getting that character's thoughts. Third person distant is where the narrator is just telling you what's happening. Hemingway is often closer to that, where you're just getting the actions on the page. You're not getting the character's thoughts. You'll get what they say. That's the only thoughts that you get from them. But this narrator has a very close psychic distance, and it is third person. We're not getting these things from Lane's mouth, but the narrator is omniscient, or semi-omniscient, because he knows Lane's thoughts. We don't get any of Sherry's thoughts. Because of that close psychic distance and the fact that this is third person, this feels very sanctimonious. This feels very preachy. This feels very heavy-handed. This feels very holier than thou. Because of the psychic distance being very close, so that we're getting all of Lane's thoughts basically in real time. But they aren't being filtered through any sort of neutral apparatus, right? We just have Lane's thoughts being given to us by someone else, almost in an epistolary form. That narrator is so close to things that it's almost epistolary, which could be part of the motif of religiosity here. But right down to the fact that the narrator is telling us that Lane is having thoughts that he's trying to ignore. You only know that if you are completely inside that character's head. And I think that that does this story a disservice, because it seems that David Foster Wallace was making the concerted effort to be more present in the work as an author than was, for example, Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway, this isn't me, baby, even when it's exactly him, even when it's autobiographical, he's trying to at least put up the facade of that distance. I don't think David Foster Wallace is removing himself from this text at all, and because of that, it feels, to me, very preachy. It feels very sanctimonious. And I think that if there were a little bit more distance in that narrative, it allows the reader the space to really make up their own mind, as opposed to feel like they're being told what it is they are supposed to think. Whether that's actually what's going on in the text, at least to me, that's how it feels. So that is what I have for Good People by David Foster Wallace. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this with other literature lovers. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every single week. And as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.